their passions and motivations and actions are dictated by worldly things. In that sense, they cannot respond to the call from without. Whereas the spiritual are those who are above the hemane, above destiny. They have a spark of the divine that is completely free and is not controlled by fate. And that's what lets them respond to the call from without the world. That's what means they're not entirely immersed in the world. I don't know if all that followed, but that's the doctrine of the doctrine of the spark. There's a doctrine of the spark of the Stoa too, which they're kind of riffing off of. But if any of that made sense when you were first reading it. No? Yes? Also find it, he puts him there because the church fathers do. Simon Magus, who is only kind of Gnostic, but he was definitely on the libertine side of the spectrum, and he was like one of the earliest that the church encountered as something to react against. Right, so Simon Magus is definitely on the libertine end of the spectrum, and so Gnostics and libertines are sort of burned into the consciousness, so to speak, by a first example. Whereas by the time you're at the Valentinians or something, it's much more on the aesthetic end of the spectrum. No, it's good to point that out because it is a curious. I don't know if inconsistency is the right word for it. If you're really reformed by being spiritual, then you would never sin again. Right? That's the closest thing you get here. That's right. The closest approach of the aesthetic version of this Gnosticism, what you find in traditional Christianity, probably more than in Paul. actual questions about it. If they were around, would Gnostics have had Kabbalah-like ways, desires to read the Old Testament Kabbalistically? Probably. They don't necessarily want to read it literally. So there are places in some of the church fathers where they find various sects that are playing, word number, numerical games and texts. They're primarily calling it the Maccabees and the Gnostics.
designed to eliminate the condition response. What one does is simply to remove the ingredient from the classical conditioning paradigm that holds the whole thing together, and that one element upon which the whole procedure depends is the unconditioned stimulus. This is why Pavlov called the unconditioned stimulus a reinforcement, because it reinforced the conditioned response. So in order to remove the conditioned response, one removes the unconditioned stimulus. During training, you will remember, the conditioned stimulus was always followed by the unconditioned stimulus. Rid of the conditioned response, we present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. A number of times, and gradually the magnitude of the conditioned response will become less and less, and eventually, when the conditioned stimulus is presented to the organism, there will be no conditioned response. When this occurs, we say experimental extinction has taken place. The conditioned response, we say, has been extinguished. After extinction has taken place, another interesting phenomenon occurs. Let's say that you take the animal out of the apparatus following extinction and return him to his home cage. Here, he is just allowed to live for one day without receiving any further training. Let's say, for example, it's a blinking light. It is the one that we have paired with the UCS. Let's say, for example, the UCS is food powder and the UCR is salivation. The conditioned response, of course, would also be salivation. Now we have reached the point in our experiment where the blinking light causes the animal to salivate without presenting the food powder. Let's take another neutral stimulus, which we will call CS2, and we will pair it with CS1 in the same way as we paired CS1 with the food powder. At this point, however, food powder is no longer part of the experiment. We are merely pairing CS2, which we will say is a buzzer, with CS1, which is a blinking light. The way we pair them is to precede CS1 with CS2, first the buzzer and then the blinking light. Remember that CS1 has already developed the capability of causing salivation. Pairing of the buzzer and the blinking light. Eventually, the second neutral stimulus also develops the capacity of causing salivation. We refer to this as higher order conditioning. In higher order conditioning, the first conditioned stimulus, CS1, acts much like an unconditioned stimulus. Apparently, this procedure can be repeated one more time. In other words, we can now take CS2 and pair it with a third conditioned stimulus, CS3.
gravity and turn your body upside down. So it can be understood in both ways. And it's also commonly, it is associated with tapas and extreme ascetic practice. And this is another place that Mark and I visited in 2017, a couple of years ago. And the temple on the top of this mountain here is a famous site associated with the legend of a yogi called Dharamnath, who is the kind of creation myth of the area, because the other side of the mountain is this place, it's in Kutch in Gujarat, so far western Gujarat on the border with India. And there's this area called the Run of Kutch, which is this huge dried salt flat. And the legend has it, and this is the kind of a recent painting on cloth that I saw at an exhibition in Delhi. And the Dharamnath is said, you can see here, he's mentioned, stood on his head for 12 years. And then as a result of that, acquired so much of this ascetic power, this tapas, the gods become scared. And this is a recurrent theme in Indian mythology of ascetics performing these penances and acquiring all this power. The gods become scared about what he's going to do with it, because they say when he opens his eyes, this blast is going to come out. And they get him to swivel away from civilization. He's for some strange reason I haven't quite got to the bottom of, he's meant to be standing on his head's on a beetle nut. He swivels 180 degrees and opens his eyes and blasts away the sea. The sea was then dried up. So we have these, sometimes these notions of tapas and also manipulation of the vital energy within the body are conflated, and you're never quite sure why someone is doing it. This is another, and I mentioned the innovations of the Hatha tradition. So, about 1,000 years ago, for the first time, we get dynamic practices within Zen, dynamic techniques associated with yoga. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this tomorrow, and I'm going to show this tomorrow, but this is about the only, I was trying to think of a good, one of the practices involves yanking on your tongue in order to stimulate Kundalini. I suppose I could have tried to demonstrate that. But this is the sort of closest to a bit of film of something that's similar to one of these practices, whereby this is Krishnamacharya, the famous yogi, sort of founder of various important lineages, and he drops himself onto his, the idea is, it's not clear whether this is why he's doing this, but the idea is that he's held his breath, and in the text that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, you hold your breath, you lift yourself up, you drop yourself down, and then the vital energy is meant to shoot up the central channel as a result. Prior to that, all of the physical methods used by these essentials were static. And then finally, yes, cleansing techniques. So the Hatha Pradipika, which is probably a text from about 1400, that's the first text that introduced these methods of cleaning the insides, the inside of the body, become very sort of closely characterized. Hatha yoga becomes very much characterized with it. So this is one called Nauli, the turning of the intestines. We have no reference to any of these practices prior to the introduction of the Hatha corpus. Okay, so that's so I've talked about how the ascetic techniques of kind of bodily mortification, and then this turn, the kind of Hatha yoga turn, in which we get a different mode of practice. We get these dynamic movements And yoga starts to shift from something being associated with asceticism and mortifying the body towards cultivating the body, doing something good for the body rather than trying to wither your arm or something in order to gain power. What I'm going to talk about now is how Hatha Yoga is first, how we first find it in textual tradition, and how it develops and how it comes, because it has these very specialized meanings at first, and then by this text that I just mentioned, the Hatha Yoga, it comes to encompass physical practice. And the reason I want to do that is because through doing that we can see the different traditions, we can see what tantric lineages lead into Hatha Yoga, and then I'll talk a bit more about the individual traditions that are part of it. So, one of the main aims of this yoga is control of bindus, semen, as I mentioned earlier. So again, the Viparita Karani is meant to be very useful in that. If you do a headstand, that stops the downward flow, and the idea is you can keep the store of bindu or semen in the head. Kichari Mudra, which Hal mentioned my PhD, that was a text of an edition of a text called Kichari Vidya, and the central practice of that is Kichari Mudra. And in that practice, the tongue is turned back above the soft palate. There are various reasons for doing that. In this text, it's in order again to seal in the sort of nectar of immortality, or the bindu that's in the head and is constantly dripping down. Normally, by sticking the tongue up there, you seal it in and stop the body from aging. And then number 9, Vajroli Mudra. That is a method of urethral suction, which again is closely associated with control of semen and bindus.
Unaware of the dangers that are but what we consciously fail to see is achieved by our unconsciousness, which passes the day of odds and dreams. Dreams may often warn us in this way, but just as often it seems they do not. Therefore, any assumption of a benevolent hand restraining us in time is dubious, or to state it more positively, it seems that a benevolent agency is sometimes at work and sometimes not. Mysterious hands may even point the way to conditions. Dreams sometimes are traps or appear to be so. They sometimes behave like the Delphic oracle that told King Croesus if he crossed the Halys River he would destroy a large kingdom. It was only after he had been completely defeated in battle, after the crossing, that he discovered that the kingdom meant by the oracle was his own. One cannot afford to be naive in dealing with dreams. They originate in a spirit that is not quite human, but is rather a breath of nature, a spirit of the beautiful and generous, as well as of the cruel goddess. If we want to characterize this spirit, we shall certainly get closer to it in the sphere of ancient mythologies, or the fables of the primeval forest, than in the consciousness of modern man. I am not denying that great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. the purpose of my comparisons between the primitive and the civilized states of man has been to show the balance of these losses and gains. Primitive man was much more governed by his instincts than are his rational modern descendants, who have learned to control themselves. In this civilizing process, we have increasingly divided our consciousness from the deeper instinctive strata of the human psyche, and even ultimately from the somatic basis of the psychic phenomena. Fortunately, we have not lost these basic instinctive strata. They remain part of the unconscious, even though they may express themselves only in the form of dream images. Play a vital part in what I have called the compensating function of dreams. For the sake of mental stability and even physiological health, the unconscious and the conscious must be integrally connected and thus move on parallel lines. If they are split apart or dissociated, psychological disturbance follows. In this respect, dream symbols are the essential message carriers from the instinctive to the rational parts of the human mind, and their interpretation enriches the poverty of consciousness so that it learns to understand again the forgotten language of the instincts. Of course, people are bound to query this function, since its symbols so often pass unnoticed or uncomprehended. In normal life, the understanding of dreams is often considered superfluous. I can illustrate this by my experience with a primitive tribe in East Africa. To my amazement, these tribesmen denied that they had any dreams, but through patient, indirect talks with them, I soon found that they had dreams just like everyone else, but that they were convinced their dreams had no meaning. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they told me. They thought that the only dreams that mattered were those of chiefs and medicine men. Were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief and the medicine man both claimed that they had ceased having meaningful dreams. They dated this change from the time that the British came to their country. The district commissioner, the British official in charge of them, had taken over the function of the great dreams that had hitherto guided the tribe's behavior. When these tribesmen conceded that they did have dreams but thought them meaningless, they were like the modern man who thinks that a dream has no significance for him simply because he does not understand it. Civilized man can sometimes observe that a dream, which he may not even remember, can alter his mood for better or worse. The dream has been comprehended, but only in a subliminal way. And that is what usually happens. It is only on the rare occasions when a dream is particularly impressive or repeats itself at regular intervals that most people consider an interpretation desirable. Here I ought to add a word of warning against unintelligent or incompetent dream analysis. There are some people whose mental condition is so unbalanced that the interpretation of their dreams can be extremely risky. In such a case, a very one-sided consciousness is cut off from a correspondingly irrational or crazy unconscious, and the two should not be brought together without taking special precautions. And speaking more generally, it is plain foolishness to believe in ready-made systematic guides to dream interpretation, if one could simply buy a reference book and look up a particular symbol. No dream symbol can be separated from the individual who dreams it, and there is no definite or straightforward interpretation of any dream. Each individual varies so much in the way that his unconscious complements or compensates his conscious mind that it is impossible to be sure how far dreams and their symbols can be classified at all. It is true that there are dreams and single symbols, I should prefer to call them motifs, that are typical and often occur. Among such motifs are falling, flying, being persecuted by dangerous animals or hostile men, being insufficiently or absurdly clothed in public places, being in a hurry or lost in a milling crowd, fighting with useless weapons or being wholly defenseless, running hard yet getting nowhere. A typical infantile motif is the dream of growing infinitely small or infinitely big, or being transformed from one to the other. But I must stress again that these are motifs that must be considered in the context of the dream itself, not as self-explanatory ciphers. The recurring dream is a noteworthy phenomenon. There are cases in which people have dreamed the same dream from childhood into the later years of adult life. A dream of this kind is usually an attempt to compensate for a particular defect in the dreamer's attitude to life, or it may date from a traumatic moment that is left behind some specific prejudice. It may also sometimes anticipate a future event of importance. I myself dreamed of a motif over several years in which I would discover a part of my house that I did not know existed. Sometimes it was the quarters where my long-dead parents lived, in which my father, to my surprise, had a laboratory where he studied the comparative anatomy of fish.
Bye.